welcome to the Allies for Justice podcast. I'm your co-host Julia.
And I'm your co-host Aiden. Welcome back to our podcast today. Today we have a special guest, Karl, who has extensive experience in community work and labor movements, specifically here in San Francisco, or particularly here in San Francisco. To give you guys a brief introduction, Karl Kramer has been the campaign co-director of San Francisco Living Wage Coalition since it was founded in 1998. Before that, he was an organizer for the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 101. He has been the parade organizer of the Cesar Chavez Holiday Parade here in San Francisco, a field organizer in San Francisco Labor Council, political director of the San Francisco Labor Council of Latin American Advancement, and the chapter coordinator of the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. Welcome back, or welcome, Karl.
Thank you.
Yay. And I also just wanted to do a brief explanation or intro of the San Francisco Living Wage Coalition. San Francisco Living Wage Coalition was born out of the labor's efforts to work with the community in organizing non-union workers. These efforts included using legislative strategies to improve their wages and working conditions, building a workers' movement, and creating the conditions for unionizing. These efforts initiated a movement that led to trailblazing local wage and benefit laws, and in conjunction with unions, organizing drives and collective bargaining agreements. Part of the Living Wage Coalition is this 5-point plan. I just want to also explain a little bit about that, or do a brief introduction about that. Generally speaking, the Living Wage Coalition's current work are workshops and campaigns to organize workers and educate the community on a 5-point program to reverse income inequality, including protecting and expanding union and public sector jobs, ending mass incarceration by the penal system, stopping the repressive immigration system, fixing a broken welfare to work system, and replacing free trade with fair trade. And I guess we'll just start off with point number 1, and we can maybe discuss all the 5 points here together. The point number 1 was protecting and expanding union and public sector jobs. Would you care to elaborate a little bit more on that, Karl?
I guess to first start off with the kind of the context of how we research these things and informed ourselves about basically another strategy that we have. So most people associate us with the strategy of raising minimum wages. And we started in San Francisco with the minimum compensation ordinance, and then in 2004 with the minimum wage ordinance. We were the 3rd city in the country to have its own minimum wage. And that has the effect of pushing up wages for those who are just above the minimum wage up to, say, $1.50 an hour. They'll also see wage increases when the minimum wage is raised. And then that also has a ripple effect throughout the economy that the idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. So that raises the standard of living for everyone throughout the community, in the idea of that building a healthy economy from the bottom up. And that was Professor Robert Reich at UC Berkeley, who used to be the Secretary of Labor, coined the term bottom-up economics. And in our investigation of how the new economy works, and it is functioning in an entirely different way than it did in the past. So if we go back to the mid-70s, when there was a economic crisis global economic crisis at that time, the response was a new type of economic theory called neoliberalism. And it's not to be confused with political liberalism, the idea of putting more money into social programs and services for the community, the people, which it's actually the opposite of that. And it's really about cutting social programs and social services. The people who brought us neoliberalism were from the conservative political spectrum. The most Republicans you'd find are neoliberals. And a good portion of the Democrats are also neoliberals, which explains a lot of the sort of splits and fights within the Democratic Party. The neoliberalism, in a nutshell, you could describe it as this view that of free markets, free enterprise, and free trade. And that if the government does anything to intervene in the economy, it will muck everything up. And that the economy is ruled by these irrefutable laws of supply and demand. And they raise it to almost a religious level, that there's this reification of the economy, that the laws of supply and demand govern everything. Everything is determined by the market, and government should have no laws or regulations that affect the economy. The most extreme end of that, the extreme view would be that there shouldn't be any minimum wage laws or even child labor laws. That all of this should be just governed by the intractable laws of supply and demand. In the mid-70s, we saw that there was the beginnings of this economic theory and political philosophy, and then it really took off on steroids under President Ronald Reagan. And he coined the expression trickle-down economics. And it's a good way of describing it, because it's that the way that the economy should work, in their view, is that most of the wealth is accumulated in the hands of those at the very top percentiles of the economic spectrum, and then they'll spend it wisely, and that will trickle down to everybody else in the economy. What we've seen, though, is that this has generated increases in income inequality as this economic theory has taken root around the globe. So now economic inequality is viewed by most observers to be the biggest challenge that people around the globe are facing, including even the International Monetary Fund, which played a big role in spreading this economic theory and in causing a lot of the income inequality. They even recognize income inequality as a growing problem facing the people of the world. And this has led to now recurring economic crises where fundamentally the majority of people in the world are not able to afford buying all the products and services that they're producing, which was the cause of the economic recession in 2008. our response to it is that by putting more money in the pockets of working people, that they'll spend it in the local economy, in the mom and pop stores, the family-owned restaurants in their neighborhood, and that creates a healthier economy. In the mid-70s, about 1 in 3 workers in the country were in a union. And that is, they had a collective bargaining agreement, which is called a union contract. And that's tremendous leverage with the owner of a company. That if a worker went in by themselves into the supervisor's office and got down on their knees and begged for a wage raise, they don't have the kind of bargaining leverage that if they got together collectively with all of the workers in their work site and put forward demands for wages and benefits and negotiated together over a union contract. The power that they have is that they could all decide to walk off the job in a work stoppage, what is called a strike. So that's tremendous bargaining leverage. So one of the first things that was done under the Reagan administration was to then wage war against unions. And starting with Reagan broke the air traffic controllers strike and sent a signal to corporations throughout the United States that they were now going into a new phase of waging war against their unions, breaking their unions, getting out of the union contracts. And we saw the percentage of union workers in this country plunge now to a level around in the private sector, under 10% of workers in the country have a union contract. So that was a big factor in pushing down wages for workers. And we found that the way that neoliberalism works is that when it isolates groups of workers from and places them in circumstances where they have to accept lower wages, that has the effect of also pulling down wages for all other workers throughout the economy. What we found is that the wages in the country are very fungible. That when wages are pulled down at one company, rival companies will be also trying to cut their wages. If one and that will also pull down wages throughout that industry. But we also see it across industries, that the investment dollars of Wall Street go to those industries or sectors of the economy that are returning the greatest rate of profit. And the way that corporations increase their rate of profit is by cutting wages. So other and in the effect of breaking unions is that this is then separating workers from each other. It's atomizing workers. So they don't have that kind of collective strength. Other ways we've seen that workers get separated and then super exploited has been with immigration policy. And so in 1984, under the Reagan administration, they introduced the Immigration Reform and Control Act. which for the first time brought immigration enforcement into the workplace. That when you get a new job that you have to fill out a I-9 form, show 2 forms of identification that you're authorized to be in the United States. That piece of paper then is filed away in a file cabinet, and the deportation police can come in and do what's called an I-9 audit and go through all of those forms and decide whether they consider some to be with fraudulent documents. We found that employers actually welcome that. There was a big case in the East Bay in San Leandro where a company, Media Copy, and this was in the late 1990s, that the company owed a lot of workers overtime and wasn't paying them. The workers then started talking about organizing a union. The company called in the deportation police. At that time it was called the INS, now it's ICE. And they started calling people into a big break room, and then they took people out the exit of the building into waiting buses, and then drove them down to Arizona to Eloy Detention Center and get them out of the Bay Area where they could maybe get pro bono legal support. So we were involved in organizing big actions, demonstrations, car caravans, putting pressure on local representatives to come out and strongly condemn this, and then pushed the INS to agree to a memorandum of understanding, which is now referred to as the MOU, that they would not intervene in a work site if there is a labor dispute or a union organizing drive. And that since is expanded also to Department of Labor, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and other government agencies that are to enforce the wage and benefit and safety regulations on the job. Also on immigration, we've been fighting for having a full legalization of all 11 million undocumented workers in the country. And as we see in this current election cycle, whenever there are these factors that are depressing wages for people, it's the people who are being victimized who are blamed for the problem instead of the government policy. And so our fight has been to change immigration policy and to have protection for workers, that where workers do not feel vulnerable about asserting their workplace rights, that the fear that the employer could call in the deportation police. Hand in hand with immigration policy, and also part of that, a big part of neoliberalism is free trade policy. So the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1984 also set up this task force to study having the first free trade law, which was then introduced and passed in 1994 under President Bill Clinton. And mentioned that because this was a Democrat, to show that that neoliberalism is often bipartisan. And it was Bill Clinton who brought neoliberalism in as part of the positions of the Democratic Party when he formed the Democratic Leadership Conference. Under the North America Free Trade Agreement was then introduced and passed in 1994, and at the time it was passed, the minimum wage in Mexico was the equivalent of $5 per day. And up until about 2018, before the past former president, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was elected, the minimum wage in Mexico had depreciated down to the equivalent of $4 per day. When NAFTA was passed, almost immediately we saw about 500,000 good-paying factory jobs in the United States were then moved to production in Mexico. And at that time, the average wage in these factory jobs was about $18 per hour, which was considered a good wage at that time. And so a lot of the companies were moving production across the border, particularly in the automotive industry. To fill those jobs in these giant factories along the border, which are called maquiladoras, the mechanism was that Mexico was forced to open up their market to U.S. agribusiness. In Mexico, the farming was done on these small fincas that are milpas, and these small milpas where they would have a few hectares. We're lucky they may have a plow animal, but they were able to sell corn at a price that they could survive, and that was because Mexico had subsidized the price of tortillas, and that brought up the what was paid for the corn. Mexico was told they could no longer subsidize the price of tortillas, and had to open up their market to U.S. agribusiness. U.S. agribusiness, which is highly mechanized with tractors and even mechanized corn pickers, with vast tracts of land and vertically integrated with also the companies that are making fertilizer and pesticides and now genetically modified seed, think Monsanto, and heavily subsidized by the U.S. government for all different kinds of things, including for the production of ethanol. So they could dump all of this cheap corn on the Mexican market, and almost within a year had 2 million families in Mexico had lost their livelihoods and were forced off their land. So they had to migrate up to the border area to try to get jobs in the maquiladoras or cross the border into the U.S. For the service industry or the meatpacking industry, where then immigration policy was used to keep down their wages in those industries. So the immigration policy and free trade policy has been used together to depress wages on both sides of the border. For the Living Wage Coalition, we started in 2008 making connections with workers in Ciudad Juarez, which is right across the border from El Paso, and has the largest number of maquiladora workers, but 200,000 maquiladora workers. And by 2015, workers at 5 of the maquiladoras in Ciudad Juarez had gone out on strike. And these factories where there's 5,000, 6,000 workers, it was massive strikes. And the workers had all circulated petitions to organize independent unions and presented these petitions for independent unions to the local labor board, and each one of them was denied their petitions. And for one group of workers that were at a factory that Lexmark's factory, where they refilled toner cartridges and inkjet cartridges, their petition was turned down because there was a typo. So the workers, and then the companies started firing all the leaders of the organizing drives, all the people that signed the petitions. So hundreds of workers were fired, and then they went out and set up encampments, plantons, in front of the factory gates. And then the businesses would, the maquiladora owners would call in the police and have them arrested. But they kept coming back and kept the plantons going. So then the labor board negotiated with the workers at one of the factories. In fact, it was one of Foxconn has 2 factories in Juarez. And they negotiated with the workers there to, if they would take down their planton, then they would be granted union recognition. They did that, but then the labor board reneged on their promise and still didn't grant them union recognition. So then they went and did a sit-in of the offices of the labor board, and finally they were granted union recognition. But that's just one step towards getting a union contract. So now all of them had been fired, and so they were trying to continue the campaign by organizing people that were still working there. So they were going out into different neighborhoods and just going out on the street and asking people if they knew anyone who worked at that factory and where they lived, and then go and visit them at their house, get them to sign a union card. And they kept at it and kept organizing. We brought this elected secretary of that union here to the Bay Area and took her around to meet with different union leaders and this was actually at a plant that the Comscope plant, that they made fiber optic cable. And a big thing at that time in San Francisco was they were going to lay fiber optic cable underneath the streets and super fast internet connection. The final outcome, though, was that in each of the cases, the workers were not able to establish they weren't able to win union contracts. And we then had a living wage coalition delegation. We organized a group of people to go down to Ciudad Juarez and meet with people, the different that were involved in these different strikes, and then wrote up a report on it, focusing on how their rights were not protected by the Mexican government. And at that point, that was in in 2016, the North America Free Trade Agreement, and one of the things that Trump had made as a campaign promise when he was campaigning in Michigan, where there's a lot of people that were impoverished when the auto industry started moving production into Mexico, was that he was going to have the North America Free Trade Agreement renegotiated. Of course, it wasn't renegotiated the way that we wanted to see it, so once it was in the House of Representatives, we then were part of a national campaign pushing to get worker protections into the agreement. And we were strategically located, being in Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi's district, and at the time she was Speaker of the House. So then we went and met with her staff and presented the report and what had happened to workers when they were exercising their rights to organize a union in Mexico. And those protections for workers' rights, and particularly the right to organize a union, needed to be in the body of the renegotiated agreement. So that then was included in the agreement, which was rebranded as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And then with the also labor law reforms that President Andrés Manuel López Obrador brought in, and then when he was elected, one of the first things he did was he doubled the minimum wage along the border areas. So for all of the maquiladora workers, they saw their wage increase from what was $4 per day to $8 per day. The maquiladora workers in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, refused to pay the new minimum wage. And 40,000 workers went on strike in Matamoros. And that then, after they finally forced all of the maquiladora owners to then abide by the new minimum wage, they then began organizing an independent union. The emphasis was on independent union, on independent, because in Mexico they had labor federations like the Confederación de Trabajadores Mexicanos, this CTM, that had what were called protection contracts. They didn't call them protection contracts, but the way that their contracts functioned was that they would go to the owner directly. Workers in the plant wouldn't even know that they had a union, and they would sign this contract with the owner, and that and the CTM even has admitted that their contracts kept down wages for workers. But when they negotiate this contract that workers didn't even know about, but if the workers started circulating a petition for a union, the owner of the company would just come out and say, well, you can't petition for a union because you already got a union, and waive this contract. That's why it was called a protection contract. In Silao, Guanajuato, part of what President Andrés Manuel López Obrador did was in the labor law reform was require that all of these contracts have to come up to a vote in the different factories. And so in Silao, Guanajuato, the workers at the General Motors plant, they challenged this CTM union there, and there was a vote, and the CTM contract won in the vote, and then workers found all of these ballot boxes in the union office, which was right there in the factory. So they then used the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to file a complaint. And under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, that both the U.S. Department of Labor and the Mexican Ministry of Labor is to investigate the violation, and there are steps that can be taken against the company, including barring that company from shipping its products out of that, in this case, to the United States. And this was they made light trucks at this plant, which at the time, light trucks and SUVs were the most profitable department in General Motors. So about at this plant, there's more than 4,000 workers, and they then were able to force General Motors to hold a vote on the contract again. It was overwhelmingly defeated now, with having both observers from the Mexican government, but even international observers that came to watch the vote. And then the next step was they voted out the CTM and voted in their own independent union.
Okay.
And the emphasis on independent from the company. Part of a lot of organizations in the U.S. Supported their campaign and supported their when they went into negotiations with General Motors, and put pressure on General Motors, and they also filed another complaint under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement against General Motors, and in the end they were able to force General Motors to agree to a union contract, which substantially raised their wages. They then also formed a worker center, Casa Obrera del Bajío, which workers from that their independent union would volunteer to go out to factories in other parts of the state and also in other neighboring states to talk to workers at other factories about how to go about organizing independent unions. And in the northern states, like in Tamaulipas, and also in the state of Coahuila, there were also other factories where workers were organizing independent unions. And so we would help in supporting those efforts, and also educating people in this country about this growing movement in Mexico. In different factories, they were successful in organizing independent unions. In other places, where they lost in campaigns, it further illustrated what were the weaknesses now in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement as far as these worker protections. In particular, the case at VU Manufacturing, that VU Manufacturing is a third-tier auto parts factory, which they would sell their parts to other bigger auto parts companies that would then sell directly to General Motors or Chrysler, Stellantis, and Ford. I should say now Chrysler is in Stellantis. So they would this company, VU Manufacturing, which is based in Flint, in Michigan, that when workers organized the independent union there, they had to file a complaint not just once, but 3 times against VU Manufacturing. And VU Manufacturing was told by the Mexican government that it had to follow a plan to remediate the violations that it had at that factory. And when it got to the what was supposed to be the time of completion of that plan, the manufacturing just thumbed their nose at the Mexican government, shut down the entire factory, laid off all the workers, and in fact left a large number of workers without their legally required severance pay. And we joined with other people from around the country to even have a Zoom meeting with the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office on what is the U.S. government going to do in response to that, because this is a U.S.-based company. Their response was that under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the worker protections are just facility-based. That is, that factory could be punished, but if they close down the factory, then there's nobody left to punish, and the company can get away with it. They could go and even set up another factory someplace else in Mexico. So the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is now slated to be again renegotiated and amended this coming year. So that is going to be something that we're going to fight, along with other organizations around the country, to have these worker protections strengthened. So on trade, these kind of issues, what's been done in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, in Central America, there was around the early 2000s was negotiated the Central America Free Trade Agreement that also concludes the Dominican Republic. And then there was an effort to negotiate a free trade agreement in the Americas, which would have expanded a free trade agreement to all countries throughout the hemisphere. And that was, we broadly speaking, as we, a movement or an international movement, was able to defeat that. And then during President Obama's administration, again, another example of how neoliberalism kind of crosses party lines. President Obama was pushing a trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that was to have a trade deal with a dozen different Pacific Rim countries, including Vietnam and Malaysia, Brunei, and that was kind of the main point, that under the World Trade Organization, that was in 1999, that brought China into a trade deal, a trade agreement. At that time, the wages in factories in China was about the equivalent of 20. So with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, what happened in China was, and think, Foxconn, which ironically is a Taiwan-based company, the largest electronics manufacturer in the world, and their factories in China were assembling iPhones. And if you and the kind of factory system they had was that many of the workers, mostly young people that were from the rural areas that didn't have all the opportunities of going to higher education, they get a job in the factory, and they would have to live in a dormitory at the factory. And if there's an order for iPhones that are coming in, they have to step up production. The supervisors would go around and knock on the doors of the dormitories to wake them up, get them out on the assembly line. And so these poorly paid, overworked, tired young people who felt trapped in these jobs, they started diving out the windows of their dormitory rooms. And then we heard a story that like 100 of them went up on the roof of a building and threatened to do a mass suicide if the conditions didn't improve. And then, and that was happening throughout China. And at one point, the Chinese Communist Party said the biggest challenge that they were facing was social unrest. So we did start seeing wages increase in China, and so and still and currently now the push is to replace production in China with production in other low-wage areas of the world. And so as wages are increasing in China, let's find someplace that's cheaper. So the idea of having like, trade deals to have more of the garment industry now in Vietnam or the electronics industry in Malaysia, and for the, to facilitate the imports into the United States from those areas. So that was the strategy of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so that it purposefully excluded China. And that was defeated. And in fact, all of the presidential candidates at that time in 2016 came out against it, except for the Libertarian. But that had the effect of also getting Trump elected, because he campaigned against it, and Hillary Clinton came out later against it, but not as strongly, and she didn't campaign in states like Michigan as much as Trump was. So that had a factor in her losing the election. And then we've seen more recently that President Biden also brought back that trade strategy. And part of it was as the Indo-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And that was some of the same countries of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but also purposely excluding China. And bringing in the Philippines. So a lot of this is done with governments that are now violently repressing trade unions in their countries. That's what's happening in the Philippines. Now there's been so many deaths, assassinations of trade union leaders in the Philippines. That's become the most dangerous place to be a labor unionist. And so when actually the name of that trade, they're not calling it a trade agreement, which would require that it go to a vote of Congress. They were, but that trade framework, actually it's called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They were going to announce the completion of that trade framework at the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation International Summit that was held in San Francisco in last fall. People mobilized to protest at that summit, and notably mostly young Filipino organizations, because they could see the writing on the wall, the devastating effect that would have economically in the Philippines. Actually, at the end of that summit, it was announced by the U.S. trade representatives that they were not able to reach an agreement, and so that they were going to come back and still push for that, but currently we're not seeing that move. So that varies. An example again of successfully having defeated a free trade agreement. Couple other things to mention in what we found in kind of our investigation of where workers who are isolated into circumstances for having set lower wages has been again something that was done under the administration of President Bill Clinton in 1996, was what he called welfare reform, and we refer to it as welfare deform. That he campaigned on that he was going to change welfare as we know it, and in 1996 pushed through a law that changed welfare from what was aid to families with dependent children to temporary assistance to needy families, and the emphasis is on temporary. That it set time limits for how long someone could be on aid, 2 years at a time or a 5-year lifetime limit, and it had work requirements. And that because of a lot of protest and struggle and movements around the country, the work requirements were expanded out. So at one end, kind of the worst of it is what people refer to as workfare, and where there was a big example of workfare in New York up until Bill de Blasio became mayor, and then he ended what was called the Work Experience Program. In New York, they were sending out mothers into the streets to pick up trash for 32 hours a week for a $300 a month cash grant and $350 in food stamps. In the organization that we supported in New York, we supported in solidarity with their efforts to get rid of that program. It was Community Voices Heard. In San Francisco, we were successful in keeping workfare out of San Francisco, except there is a program for single adults called General Assistance. But one of the things we did was include them in the minimum wage laws in San Francisco, and included in also what's called the minimum compensation ordinance, which is higher than the citywide minimum wage. At the time in 1996, there's some, well, I was mentioning that the work activities were expanded so that at one end is the workfare, and at the other end is someone could go to college or work on getting their general equivalency diploma, and that would be a work activity. But very few people are told about, an option of going to college. And in fact, in most places, they put people to work in, if they're not out picking up trash in the streets, they would be working at a government office, being paid just their TANF grant, and that they would actually be replacing civil service employees who would be, making a family supporting wage. So it was used to, bring down the wages of city employees or state employees, and at that time in 1996, there's a famous story that
Oops, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. 1996, famous story.
yeah, there's a famous story that people were telling, or economists were saying that, with this law that, forcing desperate parents out into a job market for which they aren't prepared, would depress wages for workers across, for all workers by, 80 cents an hour. And, as parents would be reaching their time limit under TANF, that they would be pushed to, get whatever low-wage job you can get. We don't care if you go to work at McDonald's, Burger King, or KFC. Just get any kind of job. So the famous story was that when President Bill Clinton was told that he said, well, I'll just put more money in the federal budget for job training. And his advisor said, Mr. President, the bond traders won't allow that. Because the whole purpose of this legislation was, that Wall Street wanted wages depressed. And that, as wages are depressed, as for one group of workers, that, depresses wages for everyone. Another way we've seen that done is that, and where we have the examples of where jobs are what's called offshored, that the production is done in China, or across the border in Mexico, or in the case of what we see right now, a lot of the call center work is going to the Philippines. Within the United States, we saw industries moving into prisons. That in the past, that usually work done in prisons was on things that didn't compete with the private sector. Like making license plates, or furniture for state buildings. But in in the 90s, we saw a big push for opening up prisons to have production done for private companies, and we saw a lot of examples where a company would have its work done in a prison, where currently the average wage is 25 cents an hour, comparable to having it offshored in other countries in Vietnam or Malaysia, or Haiti, that they would put rival companies out of business. And so that had a depressing effect on wages. That a company would be forced to cut wages just to compete with that, and could never cut it down because workers in prisons could be paid much less than the minimum wage. The minimum wage laws don't apply to labor in prisons. And that when people came out of prison, that they would then face a lifetime of job discrimination. And if you on your job application, there's that little box that says, have you been convicted of felony? And if you check off that box, then that prospective employer is just going to drop that application in the round file, in the trash can.
Right.
We supported efforts that are called like ban the box laws. In San Francisco, we have we have a law in San Francisco that requires that question cannot be on a job application, and that it can't come up until later in the hiring process. And that the employer would have to show that there is some clear connection to what are that conviction had to have some connection to what is the job responsibilities. And then also that applicant can also respond and say, well, how they were rehabilitated, or that the circumstances of that conviction, and that showing how that it's not necessarily applying to the current situation. So that helps in just being able to give some additional protection for people, in having a second chance and in being able to get employment. And of course, a lot more needs to be done, but and also a lot more needs to be done in controlling the way that prison labor is being used to compete with labor outside of prison walls. And a big part of that right now is that in California, that there's Proposition 6, which would take out of the California Constitution that that people can be enslaved if they have been convicted of a crime, and that in fact they can be forced to work in prison, and then that also applies to now the growth of private prisons, and in California we have private immigration detention centers, where people that have not been convicted of anything, that they're just waiting for their immigration hearing, and they're being coerced to work for $1 a day. So in a lot of the, on these issues, a lot of it is done by protest and supporting the efforts of, like in these detention centers. The people in the detention centers have been going out on hunger strike to protest those conditions. So supporting those kind of actions, supporting protests in the streets, and then also supporting legislation, policy changes on, in most cases on a local level, getting cities, getting San Francisco to pass different laws. We've also campaigned for a law in San Francisco that would bar the city from buying products or services that are with companies that are have connections with the prison industry. They are supporting other organizations like in Mexico that are working towards assisting workers and organizing unions to bring up wages in those areas.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds like neoliberalism is the enemy. We've seen it from so many examples nationally, really, and we were just also talking about how privatizations of public sectors and how all these companies are privatizing their, privatizing these companies to have like higher profit and making sure that people are getting lower wages. And I feel like, neoliberalism sounds like an enemy to our community and to our economic system. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We really appreciate your insight about all of this and the things that the San Francisco Living Wage does, putting a light on that. There's so many good accomplishments about different rules, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen on the, you said there's going to be a newer legislation about all this coming up the next year, and I'm excited to see what changes are going to be made and how that's going to affect positively.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was like so great, and I really appreciate you sharing as much as you shared. And I think it's like it really helps our podcast out a lot, I think. So thank you so much for being our special guest today. Really appreciate the time you took here to be with us. And we will, maybe in the future we could have a second interview with you. We'd love for you to come back. But thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Karl Kramer.
Yes, thank you so much for tuning in on today's episode. And if you want to learn more about what we just talked about or other topics, just always make sure to go on our website, and the link description will be right under the videos that we're going to post. And if you go on Spotify, you will also find different links for the YouTube and other ways to engage on the description section. Thank you so much for tuning in on today's episode.
Thanks. Bye.
Gonna take us all to make a change, take us all to win the peace. Gonna take us all in the streets, gonna take us all, gonna take us all.